Welcome, my friends, to a story of love lost and found, of long-buried secrets, and a truth that freed a young man from the shadows of his past. Enjoy the journey.
The sun cast long shadows across the weathered tombstones of St. Mary's Cemetery as Johnny knelt beside a grave, his rough hands carefully pulling weeds from the dry earth. At 20 years old, this place had been his quiet retreat for as long as he could remember. The cemetery had become his sanctuary as he struggled to survive the harsh streets of the city. As Johnny worked, he noticed movement from the corner of his eye. Looking up, he saw a well-dressed woman in her mid-40s walking through the rows of graves, her expensive shoes sinking into the soft grass. Johnny watched her with curiosity as she approached the grave, wondering what brought someone like her to this forgotten corner of the cemetery. When she reached the headstone, the woman let out a quiet sob, her shoulders shaking as she knelt beside the grave. Concerned, Johnny stood up. "Ma'am, are you okay?" he asked, his voice gruff from disuse. "Do you need me to call someone?" The woman shook her head, wiping her tears with a delicate handkerchief. "No, I'm sorry," she replied softly. "It's just this grave. I've come here before to pray for her soul." Johnny frowned, confused. This was his mother's resting place, the only connection he had to the woman who brought him into the world before leaving him to fend for himself. How could this stranger know her? "I think you may be mistaken," Johnny said gently. "This is my mother's grave, Antonia Morales." The woman's head snapped up, her tear-filled eyes widening in shock. "No," she whispered. "That can't be. The woman who took my baby is buried here." Johnny stared at her, disbelief washing over him. "Took your baby? What do you mean?" Taking a deep breath, the woman stood, smoothing her skirt. "I'm sorry," she said. "I haven't even introduced myself. My name is Nancy Carlson, and if Antonia is buried here, then you must be my son." Johnny froze, certain he'd misunderstood. "Your son?" "Lady, I think you've got the wrong person. My mother wasn't a kidnapper." Nancy shook her head sadly. "I wish that were true, but what I'm about to tell you will change everything you thought you knew." She gestured to a nearby bench. "Please let me explain." Reluctantly, Johnny followed her to the bench, keeping his distance. Nancy clasped her hands in her lap, her eyes distant as she began to share her story. 20 years ago, I was a young maid working for the Davenport family, one of the wealthiest in the city. I fell in love with their son, William. When I became pregnant, I naively believed he would marry me. She let out a small, bitter laugh. But of course his family wouldn't allow their son to marry a servant. They paid me to go away. Johnny listened, his heart pounding as Nancy described her lonely and desperate situation. "That's when I met Antonia. She pretended to be my friend, someone I could trust. But it was all a lie. The Davenports hired her to steal my baby and leave me with nothing." She looked at Johnny, her voice breaking. "You were that baby, my precious son, taken from me before I ever had the chance to hold you. I've spent the last 20 years searching for you, never giving up." As Nancy finished her story, she swayed on the bench, her face pale. Johnny rushed forward to steady her just as her eyes fluttered shut and she fainted. "Help!" Johnny called, easing her to the ground. "Somebody help!" Sanchez, the cemetery caretaker, appeared, kneeling beside them. Together they revived Nancy, fanning her gently until she opened her eyes. "Take it easy," Sanchez said. "You had us worried." Nancy looked at Johnny, clutching his arm with surprising strength. "I didn't mean to scare you," she whispered. "It's just, after all these years, finding you like this." Johnny's mind raced, overwhelmed by her words. Could it be true? Was this woman really his mother, and the woman who raised him not his mother at all? "Are you okay, kid?" Sanchez asked, watching Johnny closely. "Do you need me to call someone?" Johnny shook his head. "No, I think we need some time alone to talk." Sanchez hesitated but then nodded. "I'll be in my office if you need me." Once they were alone, Johnny turned to Nancy. "I want to believe you," he said slowly. "But it's a lot to take in. I need more than just your word." Nancy reached into her purse and pulled out a worn photograph. "This is us," she said quietly, handing it to Johnny. "You were just a few hours old." Johnny took the picture with trembling hands. It showed a much younger Nancy, beaming with joy as she held a tiny baby in her arms. The baby had dark hair and familiar eyes, his eyes. "It's me," Johnny whispered. "But why would Antonia do this?" Nancy sighed. "Money. The Davenports paid her a lot to take you and disappear. They couldn't risk a scandal with William set to inherit the family fortune." Johnny's chest tightened with anger. He had grown up struggling on the streets while his real family lived in wealth. For what? To protect a family's reputation? "So what now?" he asked. "You expect me to just forgive everything and move on?" Nancy flinched at his words. "No, I don't expect that. I know we can't make up for lost time overnight. But Johnny, I've dreamed of this moment for 20 years. Please give me a chance. Give us a chance." Johnny closed his eyes, torn. Part of him wanted to run, to protect himself from more pain. But another part, the part that had always longed for a mother's love, wanted to stay. Slowly, he leaned into Nancy's touch. "Okay," he whispered. "I'll try." As Johnny and Nancy sat in emotional reunion, Nancy's phone rang. Wiping her eyes, she glanced at the screen and went pale. "It's the hospice," she said urgently. "We need to go. Now." "Hospice?" Johnny asked, confused. "What's going on?" Nancy stood, pulling Johnny to his feet. "It's your father. He's dying." Johnny felt the world shift beneath him. "My father?" "Yes," Nancy said gently. "William, he told me the truth and he wants to see you before it's too late." They drove in silence to the hospice, where Nancy led Johnny to a private room. A frail man lay in bed, his once handsome face gaunt with illness. "William," Nancy said softly, "I found him. I found our son." The man's eyes fluttered open. "Johnny?" he rasped. "Is it really you?" Johnny approached slowly, seeing the reflection of his own features in William's face. "Yeah," he said quietly. "It's me." Tears filled William's eyes. "I'm so sorry," he whispered, "for everything." Johnny took his father's hand, feeling its fragile grip. "Why did you let them take me?" he asked. "Why didn't you fight for me?" William closed his eyes, his voice filled with regret. "I was weak. I let my mother control me. But I never stopped thinking about you." William looked at Johnny, pleading, "Can you forgive me?" Johnny's heart ached, after all these years, to finally hear the words he had longed for. "I forgive you, Dad," he whispered. A peaceful smile spread across William's face as he took one last breath, slipping away. Johnny held his hand as tears streamed down his face. At the funeral, Johnny and Nancy stood side by side, saying their final goodbyes to William. In his will, William had left everything to Johnny. But to Johnny, the greatest gift was not the money or the estate. It was finding the love of a family he never knew he had. As they stepped into the sunlight, Johnny felt something new, a sense of hope. He didn't know what the future held, but with Nancy by his side, he was ready to face it, knowing they had each other now, bound by love and forgiveness.